Ambiguity can be a wonderful thing in cinema. It allows people to bring their own experiences to movies and draw their own conclusions. But you know what? Sometimes people are just flat out wrong about a movie scene and they misinterpret the author's true intent in a way which might even end up altering their opinion on the entire movie. And I don't feel bad though, because misinterpretations like this are very, very common indeed, but ultimately they weren't actually what was intended by those in charge. So let's take a look at them. This is Whatculture.com, and these are movie scenes everyone always gets wrong. Andrew wasn't really rushing or dragging. Whiplash. The most famous scene in the tenacious Oscar-winning Whiplash sees ruthless jazz instructor Terence Fletcher become increasingly frustrated with student Andrew as he seemingly fails to match his tempo. Throughout this gut-wrenching scene, Fletcher calls Andrew out for either rushing or dragging to his beat. And to the layperson, it seems that while Fletcher may be an absolute asshole, he's also a strident perfectionist above all else. But one curious fan actually decided to take a deep dive into the scene and analyse Andrew's timing for themselves. And as it turns out, he's actually pretty much spot on, and Fletcher is just calling him out as a rusher or a dragger willy-nilly, presumably in order to get a rise out of him. While the film makes no secret of Fletcher's near psychopathic desire to push his students to greatness, many nevertheless assumed his critique of Andrew's drumming was in fact correct. Ultimately, Fletcher's method of testing Andrew's patience and commitment to perfection is defined by one line late into the movie. There are no two words in the English language more harmful than good job.
The Khan scene isn't William Shatner overacting. Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. If you look up overacting in the dictionary, you'll rightly find a picture of William Shatner, but his most widely mocked bout of scenery chewing actually isn't that at all. Or at least, not in the way so many people think. Also, overacting is great. Give me more overacting! Even people who've never seen a single episode of Star Trek might be familiar with Captain Kirk's infamous Khan scream from Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. Kirk bleats the legendary villain's name in hilariously exaggerated fashion after Ricardo Montalban's genetically enhanced space tyrant leaves him and the crew of the Enterprise marooned on the planetoid Regular. But Shatner isn't overacting. It's actually Kirk who is overacting, given that he knows full well that he and Spock have set a trap for Khan, but he can't give any inkling of this, and so plays the part of being absolutely incensed, just as Khan would expect.
Jango Fett's head flies out of the helmet. Star Wars Episode II: Attack of the Clones. Ever since the release of Star Wars Attack of the Clones, fans have speculated about the scene where Mace Windu parts Jango Fett's head from his body with a swift slash of his purple lightsaber. Moments later, we see a young Boba Fett pick up his father's helmet, causing many to note an apparent mistake, given that Jango's head should have still been within the helmet, right? Though this gaffe resulted in a hilarious R-rated fan edit, it's also easily resolved if you actually just pay attention to the scene in question. Because when Windu delivers the killing blow, there's a fleeting shot where the shadow of the helmet can be seen as it flies through the air. You might also notice here that there's a second shadow, which is clearly Jango's decapitated head flying out of the helmet, ensuring that Boba doesn't get an added grisly surprise when he picks it up. It's still a disturbing scene, mind you, but not quite as unsettling nor as mistake-laden as fans seem to think it is.
I'll Never Let Go isn't literal. Titanic. Folks love to make fun of James Cameron's Titanic for the climactic sequence where Rose tells Jack, "I'll never let go," only to quite literally let go of him moments later as she's rescued. Despite how widely parroted this facetious reading of the scene is, it's of course completely wrong. Rose isn't literally talking about the physical act of letting go of Jack as he freezes to death in the water, but of holding on to life, not giving up, and ultimately living the adventurous life she wants rather than the one that's expected of her by her family and her status. Bond isn't being callous about Severin's death. Skyfall. Midway through Skyfall, 007 and his contact Severin end up in the custody of villain Raoul Silver, where Silver shoots Severin in the head in front of Bond. Silver then asks him, "What do you say to that?" To which 007 coolly responds, "A waste of good scotch," before launching into an assault against Silver's men. At the time of Skyfall's release, there were plenty who were wound up by Bond's remark. To that, I would say that not every character in a movie has to be likable, and Bond himself has done and said way worse historically, but that's not even the defense this time. What Bond is doing here is refusing to give Silver what he wanted. Silver had been trying to break through Bond's psychological armor and rattle him, but in refusing to react and deflecting him with such a heartless one-liner, he doesn't give him an inch.
Upham isn't a coward, he's the viewer. Saving Private Ryan. One of the many disturbing sequences in Saving Private Ryan sees Corporal Upham paralysed with fear while his comrade Private Mellish is overpowered and slowly stabbed to death by a German soldier. Now, the common audience response to this scene, sadly, is that they find Upham's actions inexplicable, that his failure to save his teammate is an act of abject cowardice, and that we, the audience, would never behave in such a way. Except we most certainly probably would. The entire point of this scene, as is missed by so many, is that the average human being thrust into war would likely freeze up just as Upham did. Our knee-jerk revulsion to his inaction only underlines the part of ourselves that we prefer not to actually confront, that in a traumatic situation, heroism would actually be the last thing on our minds. To say that Upham picks up the idiot ball in this scene is to bafflingly gloss over the effects of trauma on the human psyche.
Carus's sacrifice is meant to be triumphant, The Exorcist. The debate over The Exorcist ending has been so spirited that it even led to a fallout between screenwriter and author of the original book, William Peter Blatty, and Friedkin himself. Blatty, a devout Catholic, was insistent on keeping a scene where Father Dyer and Lieutenant Kinderman walk off together talking about films, as a means of showing that Damien Carus's memory lived on. The scene was cut for the original theatrical release, ending instead with Dyer looking down the steps where Carus died, and then walking away. The thing is, despite the benefit of that additional scene enshrining Blatty's authorial intent, I still think it's clear that The Exorcist is triumphant in its good versus evil approach. It's a story about Carus's crisis of faith, and at the moment of his biggest test, he takes the demon into his body and vanquishes it by hurling himself out the window and down the steps. Dyer reads him his last rites as the two clutch their hands together tightly. It is absolutely heartbreaking in many respects, but Carus's demise is also divinely heroic. Again, it's perfectly valid to read it differently, but as far as Blatty is concerned, this is what The Exorcist means.
Tom has probably learned nothing at the end. 500 Days of Summer. Though 500 Days of Summer announces not to be a love story at its very beginning, it's also fair to say that most viewers seem to misinterpret the movie's emotional through-line, blaming Summer for her and Tom's breakup despite Tom clearly having unrealistic expectations from the outset. Even Gordon Levitt himself called Tom selfish in a recent interview, agreeing that he is effectively the villain of this movie. But the end of the film goes one step further by having Tom move on from Summer and meet a new romantic interest named Autumn. While a superficial reading would say that this is a mere cute wink to the audience that Tom has moved on to somebody new, an altogether darker interpretation is that Tom actually hasn't grown as much as he thinks he has. The fact that the film's ongoing day counter resets from 500 to 1 seems to suggest that he's going to repeat a similar cycle with Autumn. And this isn't to say that Tom didn't learn anything from his time with Summer, but that he may well fall into a similar pattern of unhealthy, obsessive romantic behavior with this new prospect. Again, as stated before, it isn't a love story.
That isn't Steamboat Willie, Saving Private Ryan. One of the biggest cases of on-screen mistaken identity has to be Steamboat Willie from Saving Private Ryan. A Wehrmacht soldier spared by Captain Miller's unit after they take his machine gun emplacement, Willie is told to walk in the direction of the Allied lines so he can be picked up by the advancing American, British, and Canadian forces. However, he shows up at the end during the battle at Rommel, having been reabsorbed into the Wehrmacht's forces. Willie fires and kills one of the US airborne soldiers before he surrenders, and is then summarily executed by Corporal Upham. However, Willie has also been charged with more crimes than the one he gets up to in Saving Private Ryan, with many viewers having mistaken him for the SS soldier who bayonets Mellish and whom Upham couldn't bring himself to kill. This is down to a few factors, namely the fact that both characters are wearing a similar uniform and aren't wearing helmets. However, they are in fact two different people who just so happen to bear a resemblance to the other.
Superman didn't make the Earth spin backwards. Superman. Few who've seen Richard Donner's original 1978 Superman will forget the iconic scene where an enraged Superman turns back time in order to undo Lois Lane's death. Superman is seen flying around the Earth to reverse time, and because we're shown Earth spinning backwards on its axis, many chose to believe that the Man of Steel literally exerted enough force on the planet itself to reverse the flow of time. But you know what? The real answer is a lot simpler and less silly than that. Superman is actually flying around the Earth in order to reach the speed of light, allowing him to travel back through time, not to pull the Earth back through time. It's still relatively ridiculous, of course, but it actually makes far more sense. Now, showing the Earth rotating backwards is just an easy visual shorthand to explain to the audience what's going to happen, though it's at least easy to appreciate why so many people have gotten the scene wrong over the decades.
Billy in 4C is actually Billy in 4C, Dumb and Dumber. A minor but extremely memorable character in Dumb and Dumber is Billy in 4C, a blind boy who Lloyd sells Harry's dead parakeet to. Despite Billy having maybe a minute of screen time in the movie, the whole gag is so hilariously cruel that his name certainly sticks out in the mind. Except he's not called Billy in 4C. You can blame Dumb and Dumber being released before audiences en masse watched movies at home and had the access to subtitles and stuff, because anyone who does turn on the subtitles on today will come to learn that the boy is actually called Billy in 4C, as in apartment 4C. It's an easy mistake to make considering how quickly Carey and Daniels race through the words in 4C, and also how relatively uncommon it is to refer to someone by their apartment number. In any case, typing Billy in 4C into Google or Twitter brings up a large number of like-minded folks who got the kid's surname totally wrong. Let the Past Die isn't the movie's central theme. Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi. Both those who loved and loathed Star Wars Episode 8 The Last Jedi gave way too much credence to Kylo Ren's memorable one-liner, "Let the past die, kill it if you have to." For many, they interpreted it as Kylo Ren essentially being a mouthpiece for the movie's central theme, that writer-director Rian Johnson wanted to quote-unquote kill the past of the Star Wars franchise by so radically shaking up the series formula. But that's not even what The Last Jedi is about. In fact, so much of the movie is still about embracing the past rather than assassinating it. Yoda literally tells Luke Skywalker in the movie, "The greatest teacher failure is," indicating a need to learn from the past rather than obliterate it entirely.
Bonnie discarding Woody doesn't sour Toy Story 3, Toy Story 4. Though fans were pleasantly surprised by the wildly unnecessary Toy Story 4, there were nevertheless those who expressed frustrations at the actions of young Bonnie, who, despite inheriting Woody from Andy at the end of the third film, ends up neglecting him in the follow-up. Some went as far as to call Bonnie the real villain of Toy Story 4, which is incredibly cruel. That in discarding Woody and moving on to the other toys, she not only broke her promise to Andy, but actively soured the perfect ending of Toy Story 3 in the process. But neither of these claims are actually true at all, beyond the fact that it's ridiculous to hold a small child to account for such a benign promise. It's important to remember that while it was a huge passing of the torch moment for Andy and the audience, it was actually likely a minor footnote for Bonnie. It's unreasonable to expect a young child to remain attached to one toy indefinitely. And in the end, Bonnie's abandonment of Woody only allowed him to realize his own sense of agency outside of ownership, becoming a lost toy capable of charting his own path. As wonderfully bittersweet as Toy Story 3's ending was, expecting Bonnie to be Andy 2.0 was obscenely optimistic, if not flat out unfair.
It's meant to be both things. Last Action Hero. Has there been an action film more unfairly reviled than 1993's Last Action Hero? I mean, seriously, it's directed by legendary action maestro John McTiernan and featured a peak of his prime Arnie in the leading role. It is at once a send-up and send-off to that iconic era of action cinema, combining fun meta jokes with an affectionate look at film's ability to whisk us away to happier pastures. And then it got eaten alive by a giant T-Rex at the box office, as well as by critics. McTiernan's movie has long been criticized for being confused between whether it wants to be one of two things, an action satire and an action celebration, epitomized in the film's closing sequences, which sees Arnie's Jack Slater come face to face with the real Arnie and then bid farewell to Austin O'Brien's young Danny Madigan. The thing is, the film has always been about both, and the most clever part of these final scenes is that we're basically having Arnie reckon not just with the legacy of his screen presence, but also his celebrity. Not vibing with that tonal contrast, I can totally get, but Last Action Hero is still way more clever than it has ever gotten credit for.
Black Widow calls herself a monster for being an assassin. Avengers: Age of Ultron. Avengers: Age of Ultron received a ton of blowback upon its release, as many fans took issue with the scene where Black Widow tells Bruce Banner that she was sterilized as part of the Black Widow program, only to follow up by calling herself a monster. Now, while you can't really blame people for not giving Joss Whedon the benefit of the doubt here, and the scene absolutely should have been handled more tactfully, the intent isn't at all to imply that she's an abomination because she can't bear children. To quote her exact dialogue, "They sterilize you. It's efficient. One less thing to worry about." about. The one thing that might matter more than a mission, makes everything easier, even killing. You still think you're the only monster on the team? If you actually break down the exchange, it's clear that Natasha is referring to herself as a monster only in the context of being a blunt object, a hired assassin shaped to murder people above everything else. If she's a monster at all, it's because of the countless people that she's killed, and obviously all of the red in her ledger, not about being unable to bear children.
The ghost job scene is a dream. Ghostbusters. Ghostbusters is one of the most beloved comedies of all time, but in recent years, as younger generations have been exposed to it, there has been increased attention paid to its most risque scene. I'm talking, of course, about the ghost job sequence, Hubba Hubba. They're ignoring one part of that equation though. It's a dream sequence. Literally, at the start of the scene, the screen goes wavy. The universally agreed visual language for the start of a dream. And once the job is done, we cut back to Ray sleeping in reality. This is in part a symptom of modern internet culture, where movie scenes are listlessly reposted online devoid of their context, often with crucial elements selectively removed. And I get it, look, it's funny to pretend that this is actually a real thing, but it's Ghostbusters. It's kind of shocking how many people have generally forgotten that no, Ray did not get noshed off by a ghost for real.
Jimmy doesn't commit suicide. Quadrophenia. Cult classic drama Quadrophenia concludes with an ending which, depending on your viewpoint, is either ambiguous or absolutely cut and dried. In the final scene, protagonist Jimmy is seen riding a scooter to the edge of Beachy Head, before we cut to the scooter flying over the cliff, albeit without any sign of what happens to Jimmy. Many, regardless, believe that Jimmy committed suicide by riding his scooter off the cliff edge, while forgetting the ever-important fact that Jimmy can be seen standing by the cliff at sunset right at the start of the movie, a scene which clearly takes place chronologically after this scooter ride. Jimmy's survival is backed up not only by the director and the lead actor, but numerous other cast members. The future is still a likely bleak one for him, but immediately less so than hurtling himself into oblivion.
It's not Childs, The Thing. One thing about modern internet criticism, everyone loves a good theory, and while they can be fun to entertain, sometimes they end up being taken a tad too literally, as is the case with one of John Carpenter's many masterpieces, The Thing. For the past decade or so, a growing contingent of folks online have insisted that the film's downbeat, ambiguous ending isn't so unclear, that there is evidence to suggest that Keith David's Childs, who joins McCready after the research station explodes, is in fact the Thing. The theory goes that this is the case because he can't be seen breathing in the cold temperature, as well as him being shot in a particular way by cinematographer Dean Cundy, where a lack of reflection in the eyes was meant to hint at who the creature had assimilated. But this isn't literally the case, and apart from the Thing's bleak, nihilistic ending working way better by not knowing whether or not Childs or McCready is the Thing, because they're dead anyway, the evidence for the theory is all circumstantial. Childs not having visible breath has been chalked up to a technical error on set, and hey, if you don't want to listen to me, take Kurt Russell's word for it. When asked about the theory by HuffPost back in 2016, Russell shook his head and said that the intent of the ending was to, quote, bring the audience right back to square one. Russell continued by saying that, quote, one of my favorite lines in the movie is, where were you, Childs? And I think that basically says it all. I love that over the years, that movie has gotten its due because people were able to get past the horrificness of the monster to see what the movie was about, which was paranoia. In short, the ending of The Thing works because we do not know, and we're not meant to.